Շատ ուրախ եմ, որ այսօր մեր տասախոսը մինչև Newport Beach-են երևակայեցեք մոտավորապես 100 մայլ անտի են հանցնարավ մինչև այստեղ գալ, որովհետեւ այս տասախոսությունը ներկայացնեմ էզի։ Ուրեմն մեր տասախոսը նախ հբարդ եմ ասելու, որ իմ գյուղացի անձն է, անջարցի է, մուսալերցի է եւ մուսալերեն ելած եւ դարձած է մասնակետ ավելի ուրեմն ուժանույթի մեջ, էներգիի մասնակետ էր ինքը արդեն եւ բազմազան բանկերու հետ եւ միջազգային գազագերբություններու հետ ինքը որպես խորհրդատու եւ որպես մասնակետ աշխատակցած է աշխարհի 4 կողմը, նույնիսկ Հայաստանի կառավարության, իշխանության իր մասնակցությունը դրամատրած է եւ սակայն վերջի վերջո որոշած է նաեւ իր այլ հնդությունները իրագործել, որոնց մեկը բանաստեղծությունն է, ինքը բանաստեղծ է նաև եւ ունի 2 հազար արդեն հայերեն բանաստեղծություններ, որոնք շատ մեծ ժողովրդականություն կրած են, եւ ամենավերջինը արդեն իսկ վեբը գրած է, որ կոչվի a place far away. A place far away, ուրեմն գիրքը այս է, եւ սա վեբ է, բայց իրականության վրա հիմնված վեբ է, իր ուսումնասիրություններեն ինքը դերակցություններ հավաքած է այս նյութի շուրջ, որ մասին ինքը մի խոսի քիչ վերջ, եւ այդ իման վրա գրած է իսկապես գեղեցիկ վեբը, որ նույնիսկ ֆիլմի վերածվելու արժանի է եւ կարծեմ արտադրությամբ արդեն ինքը աշխատի, որտեսի ֆիլմի վերածի։ Նաեւ այսօր հաջորդը արդեն գրելու սկսած է եւ ուրեմն ինքը նաեւ վիբասան է։ Ուրեմն շատ ուրախ եմ, որ Վահանը պիտի խոսի մեզ այսօր այդ մասին։ Ռամելով։
Շատ շնորհակալ եմ Անդոք, շնորհակալ եմ ձեր բոլորին, որ այս անձրևոտ օրում գրծակոս ներգալար։ Հակոբին էլ մենք համաձայնած էինք, որ խոսքը, խոսքս պետք է անգլերեն լա, քանի որ գիրքը անգլերենով է։ Եվ հիմա, որ դեսա ներկաներում մեջ գան իմ օդար ընկերներես ոմանք, մանավանդ մեկը Քուվեյթեն մինչև խոս եկած է իր դիգնոջ հետ, ամբես որ անգլերեն խոսիլ այլևս բարդատիր է, ուրեմն ես պիտի վերադառնամ անգլերենին։ Բայց որևէ մեկը, որ հարցում ունի եւ գնախնդրե հայրենով հարցնել վերջը խոսքեն հետո, սիրով կգնամ պատասխանել կամ թարգմանել կամ որևէ բան։ Nabil, before you panic, we're shifting to English. And thanks a lot for being here. Okay, you're probably one of the few non-Armenians here tonight, and I appreciate you taking the time to come. At the outset, I'd like to stress that I'm not an expert on human trafficking. In fact, this was the last thing among my various interests, until by pure coincidence, I ran into one of the victims of sex trafficking. And then it turned into an obsession. But before I go there, I'd like to start the basic background to how this book came about. I think we have to start with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was probably the single most important global event in our lifetime, everybody's lifetime here. I don't know of any other event in our lifetime, unless you were born before World War II or World War I, that changed the world in such a profound manner. And yet today we take it for granted. We forgot what it was like back then. And a lot has been written about the geopolitics of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the consequences, the enablers that caused it to fall. A lot has been written about the commercial aspects of it, the competitive environment in the world. A lot has been written about the energy impact of it. I myself, in a previous lifetime, when, as Hagop said, I used to be an energy expert, I've written a lot about how the entire geopolitical landscape, the global sector, energy sector changed because of the change of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But much less has been written about the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the individual republics. The collapse of the Soviet Union all of a sudden threw 15 independent republics into the war. These republics weren't ready, most of them, to get organized as governments. They didn't know, they couldn't replicate or replace the various social support mechanisms that the old Soviet Union used to have. And practically nothing has been written, as far as I know, or very, very little, about the impact of this collapse on individual families. Believe me that the impact on individual families was enormous. All over the Soviet Union, by the way. But there was an added impact in Armenia because it coincided with the war in ARPA and a lot of broken families, orphan children, and one of the consequences of this dislocation, social dislocation, the collapse of the social support mechanism that the old system used to have, the broken families and so on, one of the implications was an increase in sex trafficking, both internally and externally. That's where it starts. I think it would have been a very rare occasion if, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of us had run into a Russian prostitute in Dubai. Maybe you would see one, maybe, by accident. But if you saw one before the collapse of the Soviet Union, chances are she would be a well-paid KGB agent sent there to spy on the local VIPs or something. But the trafficking of humans against their will, by force, in areas outside the border of the Soviet Union is relatively new. By new, I mean post-collapse. And I think it's far more prevalent in many other countries than Armenia. I think that by far the largest has to be Russia. Ukrainians, I run into them all the time in the Gulf. But make no mistake, it happens in Armenia, and it happens by very large numbers compared to the population of Armenia. Not in absolute numbers, right? The total number of Armenian trafficked humans is far less than the total number of Russians or Ukrainians, but that's no consolation to me. Relative to the population, we may even be higher, I don't know. I haven't done the statistics, as I said, I'm not an expert on this. But it's very important to bring this back to that phenomenon. I think perhaps before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there used to be some level of human trafficking or sex trafficking, at least internally within the system. We've heard stories here and there. But it was a rare occasion that you ran into it outside. Now it's prevalent, it's all over. There is human trafficking for labor of young Armenian boys in Turkey. There is sex trafficking of young girls in Turkey, from Armenia to Turkey, to Moscow, to Dubai. So, one day I was sitting in a hotel lobby in Dubai, minding my own business, actually with a bunch of colleagues. We were there for a bank meeting, and this was a business hotel, and during the day, in the afternoon, this was not a place that you would usually run into this kind of phenomenon. So, in the other side of the lobby, I heard Armenian being spoken. As you all know, in the diaspora, what we do when we hear Armenian, especially in the Middle East, we get up, we go, Barevich Pesek, who are you, how do you do, where did you come from? But something was wrong with what I saw. There was a very young, that time it turned out to be 16-year-old, really, really drop-dead, gorgeous, beautiful girl, sitting with a middle-aged, chubbier, short-haired woman. And there was a lot of tension between them, so I couldn't interrupt too much, but I sensed something wrong, and then I started to pursue it later on. I made several other trips to Dubai. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with the story of that, because there I have also sworn to a lot of secrecy about some of the details of this. But it took me 6 months. I finally managed to convince this girl to trust me and tell me her story. And the reason it took that long and so many trips is because they are very scared, they've been threatened, they've been beaten. The last thing they're supposed to do on earth is tell their story to anyone, okay, especially someone they don't know. And the last thing, in fact, they're supposed to think about is possible rescue attempts by heroic people who come and say, okay, I'm going to take you out of here and rescue you. One of the things these organizers, the criminals, organize is fake attempted rescue attempts. They set it up, they stage it themselves to see which of the women is going to cooperate when they get an offer to be taken and rescued. And then the ones who do are beaten so viciously, and sometimes their family members back in Armenia in their villages are beaten and threatened, that that's the last time they would ever trust anyone who says, I'm here to rescue you. So I had to take an oath that I will never try heroics trying to go and rescue them. I have to take an oath, I will never disclose their names, I have to do all those kind of things. Finally, she trusted me enough to start the story. And then she brought some of her friends. It was easier, actually, because once one of them trusts you, you can actually do it easier with others. Long story short, I gathered, I probably interviewed at the time in Dubai 12 different Armenian girls, all of whom claimed to be there against their will, by force. Now, I have to admit something here. I didn't believe all of them, by the way. I think at least 4 of these 12 had volunteered for the job, but they did not want the moral and ethical burden of having volunteered for the job, and they were pretending that they were forced. But the other 8 really were forced, and I could tell. At that point, you know, when you hear some of the details of their story, I assure you, if you're human, it is impossible to remain indifferent. Just impossible to forget it. Impossible to turn your back and walk away and pretend you didn't see what you saw and you didn't hear what you heard. But the biggest question is, given the constraints and given the promises you have made, what do you do? What do I do? Do I go both guns blazing? And do I go bring government officials, by the way, which I tried at the time? Do I go talk to the UN organizations, which also I did before? But a lot of these things didn't seem to get much traction because they wanted to know details, names, locations, everything, which I couldn't disclose. That's where the idea of a novel, in fiction form, came to me, because I'm 100% convinced that raising public awareness of this phenomenon is absolutely critical. And I'll come back to explain why I think it is critical. But it's the only thing people like me, I believe, can do at this point. Now, public awareness, check this here. Public awareness is critical at least 3 different levels. Number 1, it alerts the potential victims. Some of these victims are honestly so naive, so desperate actually to believe good news, so desperate to believe in a promise of a better future that they will believe anything. And they get conned, they get duped, they get all kinds of incredible, fantastic promises of careers, some very simple, like salesperson in a big department store, some much more fancy, like modeling, which is the basis of the character in the novel, that they want to believe it so bad that they believe it even if it sounds implausible. And they trust these people and they go, and the next day, sometimes the same day, they're beaten, raped viciously by more than one person and thrown into prostitution that very same day. They don't even know what hit them, what happened to them. It's important to raise public awareness because it's important some of these potential victims to know, not to believe every promise. Now, this novel has been translated into Armenian, and I've put it in most village libraries in Armenia because I want those villagers especially to have to read it. They cannot afford the price, but I put them in every library, at least in, not every, but in several regions, several marches, I put the book. That's important. Second issue of public awareness has to do with the criminals. The ideal environment for the trafficker is that people remain quiet, they don't discuss this, and here in our Armenian community, by the way, the tendency is, you don't discuss this, amote. It's shameful, it's painful. How do we discuss this kind of thing? Armenian girls working as prostitutes, how do we take this public and how do we take this international, let alone public? There was a reason why I wrote this book in English. As Hagop said, my first volumes are in Armenian. I could have written this in Armenian, maybe more easily than English. But it is important to make international noise with this, and I'll come back to that also in a second. So this ideal environment for the criminals is one where all of us here sit there quietly, ashamed, embarrassed, or afraid to talk, so that in that overall silence they go do their thing in peace. Let's not give them that. I think everyone in this room who doesn't scream about this is part of the crime. I'm sorry to say it so rudely, but I believe that. But perhaps the most important, third and most important reason for raising public awareness is to alert the government and the government agencies who are supposed to be enforcing the law. Armenia has lots of laws, by the way, against trafficking, against sex trafficking, against trafficking of children. Now, I am convinced, and I have some evidence actually, that shows the only time that the government will push its agencies responsible for this to go and give this issue some priority, give the law enforcement in this area some priority if it becomes a wide enough public concern and public issue. Otherwise, it's not a priority, and it has never been a priority. Back in 2004, there were between 400 and 500 Armenian girls in jails in Dubai for the crime of prostitution. And those who knew or admitted treated those victims among those 400 as the criminals. They're all prostitutes. Well, why are you wasting your time? You know. By the way, let me stress at the outset that my issue here is not with prostitution. I don't want to offend anyone here, but frankly, that's not what bothers me. Right? It's supposed to be the oldest profession on earth. Nobody has been able to stop it. I'm not on a crusade to stop prostitution. Even some social scientists argue that actually it performs a useful function in society. I will not go that far, but it's not the kind of thing you can stop. My issue here is with sex trafficking, which is entirely different. The issue here is taking a 16-year-old girl from a village who knows nothing about the world, hasn't even been to Yerevan yet, based on false promises. You rape her, you throw her into this thing, you bring her 20, 25 clients a day, and you take all her money, you become rich of her, and she's there suffering, she doesn't know how to get out of it. That is a different crime altogether. That's the kind of thing that, when I said at the beginning, if you're human, you cannot remain indifferent, that's what I'm talking about, not prostitution per se. So, when you treat that victim, who's now, yes, she's a prostitute in Dubai, yes, and she is getting 20, 25 clients a day, yes, but if you treat her as the criminal rather than the victim, then something is totally wrong in your understanding of what's going on. Then, in 2004, a very interesting documentary came out. I mentioned that in the book. It was issued by Edik Bagdasaryan of HETK Investigative Reporters in Armenia. If you don't know HETK, please, hetq.am, go have a look. It's a 4-part series. It exposed, they went with hidden cameras. By the way, they can never go back to Dubai now, but anyway, they went with hidden cameras, they took videotapes of the whole scene, they interviewed many Armenian prostitutes and some of their pimps. They issued this documentary called Desert Nights. There was an attempt on Edik Bagdasaryan's life a month after he issued this documentary in Yerevan. He survived it, thank God, because he's an incredible reporter. And he helped me a lot when I was doing the research on this. Had it not been for the public awareness created by Desert Nights, this wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened. We would have had 1,000 Armenian girls rotting in jails today if it hadn't been for that public awareness that was raised. There are sometimes an article is written, and 10 people read about it, nothing happens, the government says it's not a hot issue. Some other times the news comes out and the people actually respond. There's responses, there's reaction, there's documentaries, people follow. More than 10 people read it, then the government understands that this is a public issue worth following. In my own case, let me say, when I first was doing the research for the book, I tried to interview a lot of people. A lot of people discouraged me from writing the book. Some meant well. Some were of the type, I know they were meaning well. There were people who were kind of embarrassed, amote, it's shameful, it's painful, why do you want to write about this, write about something else. I consider those friendly but misguided objections, and most of those people I have managed to convince otherwise, that they're wrong, that this is precisely the kind of thing that we should get out. But there were also the more sinister types of attempts to discourage me from writing. Almost like threats, people saying, you remember what happened to Eddie, blah, 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 same can happen to you, you better be careful, and so on and so forth. They were actual threats. What these people didn't know, like Hagop said, is that I'm from Musada. It's not that easy to scare us. And in fact, when we see a threat like this, we get even more emboldened. Especially when we believe the cause. But the most interesting part is not that. The most interesting part is, after the book came out, and after especially it was translated into Armenian, and we had a huge showing in Armenia with, on every talk show, on TV, Shnorantes, this, that, the other. Even those who were trying to discourage me from writing embraced it. It's out already, what can they do? And the government embraced it. The Deputy Prime Minister, who chairs a committee, specifically a committee designed to fight human trafficking in Armenia, embraced it, called me, came. The American ambassador had given a reception in his house to present the book. He was present. A lot of high-level police, people from the police were there, who were involved also in fighting human trafficking. They were there. They were all very nice, thanking me for writing the book. But I bet you, before I wrote it, some of these people would have tried to stop me. I don't know how much difference these things make, but I have a few, what may be called circumstantial evidence perhaps, that I think they will make a difference. The government will not make this a priority unless they know it matters to someone or to the public at large. I'd like to say a few more words also about some of the organizations that I ran into while doing the research. First, let me stress that every penny of the proceeds from the sale of the book go to organizations fighting or preventing human trafficking. Right now, 2 organizations receive all the proceeds from this book. One is Oran. I don't know if you know Oran. Those of you who've been to Armenia maybe do. Oran is a very interesting organization. It doesn't directly fight sex trafficking, but what it does is by removing all the poorest children from the streets, all the begging children that they can find or they can convince their parents, they remove them from the streets, they give them a school, a home, three warm hot meals a day, and an education. I think by just doing that, they have prevented hundreds of cases of potential trafficking in Armenia. Because the ideal target for a sex trafficker is this 11-year-old girl in rags begging in the streets of Yerevan. It's perfect. That girl has no support. You grab her, throw her in the car, you don't even have to fool her with false promises. You take, nobody will know where she is, done, you're done. And there are cases exactly like that. So by removing hundreds of these kids from the streets, Oran has already prevented, in my opinion, hundreds of cases of trafficked victims. The second is a non-Armenian organization called UMCOR, United Methodist Center on Relief. Now, you say, why United Methodist Center on Relief would be on my list? Well, they have a wonderful presence in Yerevan. They have a shelter where rescued sex trafficking victims come. I've been to that center. I have interviewed all of the girls there. A lot of them were actually internal sex abuse and trafficked girls, and a few were from overseas. They do wonderful work. And had it not been for UMCOR, these girls would have been lost for sure, dead. By lost, I mean in this case, dead. Now, very interesting phenomenon here also. I said the government started becoming more diligent after it became a public issue. One proof was when I was interviewing these girls in UMCOR Center, the shelter. Almost all of them, when they had found an opportunity and ran away from their captors, had called the police. Before this, before the noise that was made about this, the police wouldn't have paid any attention. At all, at all. They would have said, go back to your father or to your husband. But now, in every case, it was the police who went, took the girls, and brought them to the UMCOR Center in Yerevan, to the shelter. This wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened unless two conditions were fulfilled. Number one, that this public awareness was raised high enough that it became finally a priority on the government agenda. And number two, the shelter existed in the first place. Where else would they have taken it? There are other organizations. These two are only, right now, the ones I cooperate with, and I give them all the proceeds. But there are two other organizations which are absolutely critical, I think. One is an institution called Merdun, Our Home, in Echmiadzin. I've been there too. What Merdun does is something very interesting. By law, everyone in orphanages of Armenia, and our orphanages in Armenia were full, by the way, started with the ARPA war and onwards. When they reach 18, they have to leave. They cannot stay in the orphanage. What's an 18-year-old girl being dismissed from an orphanage going to do in Yerevan? She has nowhere to go. She has no family. Maybe some of them have a brother or an uncle who put them in the orphanage in the first place. They don't have real skills to speak of. They have no means to go to school. Some of them end up being the so-called quote-unquote voluntary prostitutes because they think they have nothing else to do. And some of them become victims of the traffickers. What Merdun does is takes these 18-year-old orphans directly from the orphanage, gives them this beautiful home where I've been, I've met all of them, I've spoken to all of them, sends them to school, keeps them there for as long as they want to stay, sometimes finds them job, puts them in universities, and a lot of them actually get married from the orphanage. And there is one wall they have of all the married ones with their children who come back and visit them. It's a beautiful place. Now, that's an organization worth supporting, because I think these girls, if they had really nowhere else to go after that orphanage, they'd be lost. The second one, very similar, is Huso ID, Garden of Hope. That's in Yerevan. Huso ID is financed by one family, the Baghjans. They finance the whole thing. But this, in here, they take not necessarily orphans, but from the poorest families, the young girls, 18 and above, they send them to college, they finance their tuition, they give them all their living expenses, and they watch them till they grow, graduate, find a job, or get married. In other words, give them options other than choosing to be a prostitute or being a victim of sex trafficking. Without these institutions, these girls have no other options other than these two. I'm telling you, that's how it is right now, unfortunately, the situation. So, sorry, I talked longer than I thought I was going to talk. Because I'd like to give you all a chance to have a discussion, have some questions, and so on. What do we do? A lot of times, I mean, I was on this East Coast book tour. Inevitably, one of the questions is, someone gets up and says, what can I do? It's a very fair question, and it's a very difficult question. I mean, the root cause of all this is the socioeconomic conditions in Armenia. Let's make no mistake about it. If the economy was different, more promising, if there was hope, if there was some growth, if there was more unemployment, if there was opportunities for these young people to even go get an education, a lot of this would be much less than it is today. I'm not saying it would be eliminated, but it would be much less. And the other part is the social conditions. We have a lot of broken families. The whole concept of this family sanctity, which in the diaspora we grew thinking an Armenian family is sacred. I mean, that's like the core. You never rely on governments for the protection of your children. Your children are the family responsibility. That doesn't exist there to the same extent. Don't forget, 70 years of communist rule. These things aren't. They're very diluted. If they're still around, they're around in some of the remote villages that didn't care about communism. But they're not there. Either physically broken families, in other words, one of the parents is dead or gone to Russia to find a job and never came back. I've seen a couple of cases, by the way, of traffic victims who were sold by their own relatives. One girl, her uncle was a drug addict. To fund his addiction, he sold the girl. I've seen it with my own eyes, this one. So we have a social environment and an economic environment which is enabling all this. One thing, if you have the means to do even the smallest thing to improve this socio-economic environment in Armenia, you'll be helping. Second, I mentioned 4 organizations. There are others. Support them if you can. If you have a charity you'd like to donate during this Christmas season or New Year, choose one of them instead of something else. Really, it matters. These are groups where every penny actually is accounted for. This is not like giving to a government to build a road where 80% goes away, right, somewhere else. No, seriously, these are privately funded organizations by donations from people where every penny is accounted for and there's no such seepage like you have heard about in Armenia. Third, be an advocate of the cause. And I'm not embarrassed or ashamed to say, buy my book. The reason I'm saying that is not for self-gain or self-profit. I have no profit from it. But if every dollar that's spent on that book first goes to support these organizations anyway, but also with the same dollar, you raise some awareness, both in the community and internationally, And also, you send a message to the government that, look, this issue matters enough. Look, the book is selling. Because if it doesn't sell, it means it doesn't matter, the whole thing. So with the same dollar, you support the organizations and you support the cause. That's the only reason why I'm not embarrassed to stand here today and tell you, buy the book. Buy a lot. Give Christmas gifts. This year, don't waste your money on fancy, useless Christmas gifts like silk scarves or whatever. This is much cheaper and much more useful. So, that's where it is. That's where it started. That's where the book ended. It's been only a few months now that it's been out, but it's made a lot of noise already. It has made, actually so far, a lot more noise internationally than among the Armenian community. 70–80% of total sales have been to foreign contacts of mine and different organizations. But as Habib said, I'm working on the sequel because there are a lot of loose ends in the book. The main plot comes to a conclusion, but there are lots of subplots which don't. And I get hundreds of emails from readers who say, wait a minute, what happened here, what happened that, what happened to that? So I have to complete some of the stories, so there's more work for me, started it. And there is work on a screenplay to try and turn it into a movie. That's all I have. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions in any language.